What comes to mind when you hear the words Roman soldier? Probably the image of indestructible power, the slender ranks of legionaries in shining armor, the eagles of the legions proudly roaring against the sunset, and the cold, confident march of those who bring civilization and order at the point of a sword. It is an image created by triumphal arches, marble bas-reliefs, and Hollywood movies. An image of power, glory, and immortality. But what if we put aside the glitter of metal and look under the helmet? What if you imagine yourself in the shoes of that soldier? Not a general, not a centurion, but a simple legionary. Gaius or Marcus, yesterday's peasant or urban poor, who traded his freedom for 25 years of service in exchange for a stable ration and a phantom hope for the future. And here's the main question. Would you be able to go this way? Could you give up your identity, your name, your past, and become a cog in a great military machine? Would you be able to endure 25 years of martial arts, marching, building camps and bloody battles in order to get a piece of land and a certificate of honorable discharge at the end? Stay to the end and you'll learn how an oath turned a free man into the property of the state. Why discipline was more fearsome than the enemy. What a legionary really felt under a hail of arrows. How a soldier's life differed from that of a mere plebeian. And why the brotherhood of the tent was more important than family. This is not just an account of war. It is a story of the complete rebirth of man, of survival and the price paid by those who held the full might of Rome on their shoulders. It didn't start with a sword, but with a word. With a terrible, sacred, and irrevocable word, Sacramentum. It was not just an oath of allegiance, as it is understood today. It was a ritual, a mystical act that ripped a man from his former life and bound him forever to a new entity, the Legion. When a recruit joined the army, he was no longer a son, brother, or husband. He became the property of Rome, and his only family was the eagle of the Legion. The procedure was solemn and intimidating. The new recruits, who had passed a strict selection process of height, strength, endurance, and even visual acuity, were lined up in front of the Legion banners in the altar. The legate or tribune read out the text of the oath, and each soldier, speaking forward, said, "Idem in me." The same for me. He swore to obey his commanders without hesitation, to obey any order even if it led to certain death, and never to leave the ranks without permission. He swore to put the interests of Rome and the Legion above his own life. This oath had not only legal, but also sacred power. To break it meant not only committing a crime, but also incurring the wrath of the gods. Desertion or disobedience was punishable by death, often painful and shameful. Sacramentum was a one-sided contract. The Legion gave you food, weapons, and pay, and you gave it everything. Your body, your will, your 25 years of life. There was no return. From that moment on, your fate was decided not by you, but by the centurion's orders. This ritual was a powerful psychological tool. It erased individuality. Yesterday's Gaul, Syrian, Italian, or Spaniard, when he took the oath, became part of a faceless but unified body. Their common past did not matter. Only their common future of service mattered. The oath was the first common experience that united hundreds of strangers. They experienced this rite of passage together, felt the fear and solemnity of the moment together. It was the birth of a new brotherhood, cemented not by blood, but by a common oath before the gods and the eagle. This shared experience laid the foundation for future relationships. The young recruits, torn from home, found support in each other. They learned to march together, received their first strokes of the centurion's stick together, and ate their first soldier's porridge together. Their old life was dying here, on this training ground. And the new one began with the realization that now the only one who would understand you and have your back was a new recruit like you, standing next to you in the ranks. Thus, Sacramentum was more than a mere formality. It was a watershed, a point of no return. By saying it, you were voluntarily agreeing to a complete reformatting of your personality. You ceased to be a human being in the civil sense and became a soldier, a function, a tool, a living weapon in the hands of Rome. And the first step on this path was complete and unconditional obedience. If oath was the soul of the Legion, discipline was its steel skeleton. The Roman army conquered the world not because of numerical superiority or unique weapons, but because of disciplina militaris, a system of total, pervasive, and ruthless control that turned a crowd of armed men into the perfect killing machine. For the common legionary, discipline was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality, often more terrible than enemy spears. At the center of this system stood the centurion, the commander of the centuria, 100 men. He was a battle-hardened veteran whose chief instrument of power was not tactics, but vitus, a stick made of vine, with which he had the right to beat soldiers for the slightest offense. Incorrectly cleaned armor, sleeping on duty, a lost piece of equipment, sluggishness on drills. All this was punished with immediate and painful blows. The centurion was a father, judge, and executioner to the legionaries. They feared him, hated him, but obeyed him unconditionally because they knew that his cruelty was the key to their survival in battle. Punishments were graduated, but always severe. For minor misdemeanors, there was flogging, additional outfits, and reduction of rations. For more serious ones, such as sleeping on duty or losing a weapon in battle, there was fustuarium, the death penalty, when the guilty party was stoned or caned to death by his own comrades. It was a terrifying ritual that demonstrated that the life of one soldier was nothing compared to the safety of the entire legion. The worst collective punishment was decimation, the execution of 1 in 10 by lot in a unit that showed cowardice. Imagine this horror. After a lost battle, your squad is lined up, and you look into the eyes of your comrades with whom you shared a tent and bread, knowing that now fate will decide which of you will die at the hands of your own brothers in arms. Decimation was rarely used, but the very threat of it kept the legions in an iron fist. Fear of their commanders had to be stronger than fear of the enemy. But discipline isn't just punishment. It was also an endless, exhausting routine. Every day of a legionary's life was scheduled to the minute. Rising before dawn, morning inspection, hours-long drills, marching in full-dress uniform, practicing combat formations, fencing with wooden swords, throwing weighted spears, then work around the camp, cleaning weapons, repairing equipment, building fortifications. This monotonous, hard work exhausted them physically and mentally, leaving no time or energy for unnecessary thoughts. It turned soldiers into automatons whose bodies reflexively followed orders. In this atmosphere of total control and constant pressure, the bonds within the smallest unit, the contubernium, a tent union of 8 men, were the only salvation. Outside the service, in the cramped space of the tent, one could take off the mask of the unquestioning doer. Here you could complain about a centurion's cruelty, ask a comrade to help clean your shield, share a secret piece of cheese. This micro-solidarity was the only outlet. People who endured the hardships of discipline together became closer to each other than family. They learned to trust and rely on each other because the system was designed to break each one individually, but make them survive together. Thus, disciplina was a double-edged sword. It deprived the soldier of freedom and human dignity, but it also turned him into part of an invincible force. It was a source of constant fear, but it was also the only guarantee of survival on the battlefield. And every legionary knew, obey, endure, and do as ordered, or die, often by their own hands. Contrary to popular belief, the Roman soldier spent much more time marching than fighting. His life was an endless march, iter. The road was his home, his job, and his curse. Legions were constantly moving across the vast territory of the empire, suppressing rebellions, fortifying borders, moving from one theater of war to another, and each such crossing was the toughest test of endurance. A standard day's crossing was about 25 to 30 kilometers, but at an accelerated pace the legion could go up to 45, and it was not a light walk. Each legionary carried a load of 30-40 kilograms. It was his personal cavalry, which he carried on his shoulders day after day, week after week. The cargo, which the soldiers humorously called muli mariani, included everything necessary for war and survival. First, full armament. Plate armor, lorica segmentata, or ring armor, lorica hamata, helmet galea, large rectangular shield scutum, 2 spears, pile, and a short sword gladius. Secondly, personal equipment. 2 wooden piles for building suits, a pickaxe, a shovel or hoe, a pot for cooking food, a flask of water or pasca, a leather bag with personal belongings, a change of tunic, sandals, a firebrand. Thirdly, rations for several days, usually 3 to 4 kilograms of grain. All this was attached to a T-shaped pole, which the soldier carried on his shoulder. Imagine this march. Thousands of men in heavy armor marching down a dusty road under the scorching sun of Gaul or the hot sands of Judea. The monotonous creaking of leather belts, the heavy breathing, the clanking of weapons. Dust clogs your nose and throat. Sweat drenches your eyes, straps of armor and equipment rub your shoulders to the point of bloody blisters. My feet, shod in caligas, soldiers' sandals with studded soles, are buzzing with fatigue. But you can't stop. It is necessary to keep the pace, to keep the line. The centurion drives the laggards with his stick. This endless march was not just movement, but part of training and discipline. It develops superhuman endurance and cohesion. Soldiers learn to help each other, to support a stumbling comrade, to share the last sip of water from a flask. At such moments, words were not needed. A simple gesture, a glance, and you realized that you were not alone. Your neighbor in the ranks was suffering just as much as you were. This common suffering was more unifying than any ideology. It was especially hard in the tent, contubernum. 8 men who had been marching shoulder to shoulder all day, in the evening they would collapse from fatigue. Often there was no strength even to light a fire and boil porridge. The tent master distributed the duties. 2 would go for water, 2 for firewood. The rest would pitch the tent and dig a ditch for the camp. In this routine, in this joint overcoming of fatigue, true brotherhood was born. Men who together dragged their cross along the roads of the empire became each other's sole support. They shared not only the hardships of the campaign, but also the silent understanding that their life was a road without end. Marching was the quintessential soldiering experience. It was tedious, monotonous, and brutal. It erased personality, turning a man into a walking machine. But it also molded recruits into hardened veterans capable of enduring any hardship. And when the enemy appeared on the horizon after a long transition, the legionary felt almost relieved. The battle was terrible, but at least it was the finale of this endless, exhausting journey. After a grueling day's march, when there seemed to be no strength left even to breathe, the legionary was not waiting for rest, but for the most important and sacred part of his routine, the construction of a fortified camp, castra. It was not just a place to sleep, it was a ritual, a symbol of Roman order in the midst of barbarian chaos, a fortress that the legion erected every night wherever it was in the forests of Germany, the mountains of Armenia, or the deserts of Africa. The ability to build a camp quickly and efficiently was as important a weapon as the gladius. The soldiers, barely having thrown off their heavy equipment, took up the picks, shovels, and hoes they carried with them. Construction began. The first thing to be dug was a deep ditch, fossa, around the perimeter of the camp. The earth from the ditch was used to build a rampart, ager, on the inside of the camp. On the crest of the rampart, a perimeter of 2-meter-long pointed piles, suits, was erected, which each legionary carried on his own. As a result, in 2 to 3 hours, an impregnable fortress capable of withstanding a sudden night attack was erected in an empty place. Inside the camp, everything was also subject to strict order. Leather tents were set up, each for 8 men, contubernum. In the center of the camp was the commander's tent, praetorium, the headquarters and the altar with the banners of the legion. The streets were straight, intersecting at right angles, allowing troops to move quickly to any part of the defense. Sentries were posted around the perimeter. No one could enter or leave the camp without a password. For a soldier, building a camp was the last test of the day. After a 30-kilometer march, he had to dig in frozen or rocky ground for several more hours. It required colossal physical and volitional efforts. But everyone understood. His life depended on the quality of this work. A well-built camp is a guarantee of a good night's sleep, protection from wild animals, and, most importantly, from a sudden enemy attack. Roman commanders knew that an army that sleeps in safety fights better. This daily ritual was the essence of the Roman approach to warfare. It was not improvisation, but a system. Not the genius of a single man, but the concerted work of thousands. The camp was not merely a defensive structure, but the material embodiment of discipline, order, and collective will. And for a soldier exhausted by the march, the sight of these even rows of tents and secure fences was the best comfort. Here, in this fortress for one night, he was at home. The basis of the diet, like that of the civil plebeians, was grain, wheat, spelt, or barley. Each soldier received a daily ration, about 800–900 grams, and had to prepare his own food from it. The grain was carried with them for several days of the campaign and was ground into flour with the help of hand millstones, which were in every tent. It was extra work at the end of a hard day. The flour was most often used to make a thick porridge, pulse, analogous to civilian porridge, but perhaps even thicker and more nourishing. Sometimes they baked unleavened cakes or galettes, panis militaris, hard as stone but able to keep for a very long time. The second most important food was bacon or salt pork, laridum. Fat and salt were vital for regaining strength and water-salt balance after grueling marches. A piece of lard added to porridge turned it into a much more nutritious and tasty dish. It was the main source of animal protein that distinguished the soldier's diet from that of a poor city dweller. The third whale of a soldier's menu was cheese. Hard salted sheep or goat cheese was easy to transport, did not spoil for a long time, and served as a great addition to bread. It provided the protein and fats needed to maintain muscle mass. As far as beverages were concerned, the legionary's chief friend was pasca. It was not wine in the usual sense. It was cheap, sour wine vinegar diluted with water. Pasca was not so much a drink for pleasure as a means of hygiene and recuperation. It was an excellent thirst quencher, had antiseptic properties, which was critical when drinking water from dubious sources, and helped restore strength due to its electrolyte content. It had a pungent, sour taste, but soldiers grew accustomed to it and appreciated it for its effectiveness. Sometimes the rations varied. If a legion camped for a long time, soldiers could hunt, fish, pick berries and mushrooms. Sometimes they bought or requisitioned vegetables, fruits, and fresh bread from the locals. But on long campaigns through hostile territory, soldiers had to rely only on standard rations. Although the food was crude and monotonous, it was reliable. The soldier knew that as long as the supply system functioned, he would not starve. That meant he would have the strength to march, build, and fight. In the days of the early empire, 1st to 2nd centuries AD, the annual salary of a legionary was 225 denarii. It was not a huge sum, but it was guaranteed. It was paid 3 times a year. However, the soldier did not receive everything. There were mandatory deductions from the salary. First, for food, annona. Secondly, for equipment. The state issued weapons and armor, but often had to pay for their repair and replacement. Third, there was a kind of mutual aid fund or savings fund of the Legion, where everyone contributed some money. These funds were used to organize festivals, funerals of fallen comrades, and were kept by the standard bearer of the centuria. But the main economic dream of every soldier was not wages, but war booty, preda. After a successful battle or the capture of an enemy city, all the captured property, gold, silver, weapons, livestock, and even prisoners sold as slaves, was collected and divided among the soldiers. The distribution was according to rank. The general received the lion's share, the centurions a large part. But the common legionaries also received enough to make their eyes burn with greed. One successful campaign could enrich a soldier more than 10 years of service. This hope of prey was a powerful psychological dope. It made the legionaries fight with rage and despair. They went to the assault, knowing that not only death but also riches awaited them outside the walls of the city. The booty was a just reward for the risk. It was the visible proof of their victory. In addition, there were also extraordinary payments, donativa. The emperors, on coming to the throne or wishing to gain the support of the army, often gave generous monetary gifts to the soldiers. The loyalty of the legions was expensive, and emperors were not stingy to buy it. Within the tent fraternity, contubernium, money was often shared. Soldiers could pool their money to buy drinks, play dice for common stakes, or lend it to each other until payday. Those who were more fortunate in robbery could share with less fortunate comrades. This financial relationship bonded them even more tightly. They were not just brothers in arms, but economic partners, whose well-being depended on each other. This mutual assistance was an unwritten law of soldiers' life. Thus, the economics of the service were twofold. On the one hand, a modest but stable salary that provided basic needs. On the other was a gambling, bloody lottery of military booty, which promised riches and a better life. This system made the soldier both a calculating worker and a greedy predator, willing to do anything for gold. In the impersonal and dehumanizing system of the Roman army, the only island of humanity, the only refuge for the soldier's soul was his contubernum, the tent fraternity. It was the smallest unit in the legion, consisting of 8 to 10 men who lived, ate, slept, and fought together. For a legionnaire separated from home and family for 25 years, these 7 men were becoming his true family. A family he had not chosen, but one that was closer and more important than his blood family. They shared one leather tent measuring about 3 by 3 meters. In this cramped space, there was no room for secrets or personal privacy. They saw each other in their most vulnerable moments: sick, wounded, scared, drunk, homesick. They knew everyone's habits, fears, and dreams. They had frozen together on cold nights in Germany and suffocated in the heat in Egypt. They had one cauldron for food, one grain trough, one common fire. This forced closeness created ties of incredible strength. The soldiers in one contubernum called each other brothers, fratres, and it was not an empty word. They cared for each other like family. If one fell ill, the others tended to him, sharing their portion of wine or a warm cloak. If one died in battle, his comrades buried him, gathered up his meager belongings to send to his family if possible, and remembered him long by the evening fire. In battle, they fought shoulder to shoulder, covering for each other. To lose a comrade from one's tent was a personal tragedy. This sense of elbow, this confidence that the man beside them would not waver or run, was the basis of the legion's fighting spirit. The centurion could control them with fear, but they fought because of their loyalty to each other. In this strictly male environment, where women were rare and temporary, emotional ties between men took on a special depth. Brotherly love, friendship, support, all of these were vital to psychological survival. In some cases, these bonds grew into something more. Long-term partnerships based on deep affection and mutual care were not uncommon. 2 soldiers could serve together for the full 25 years, sharing everything from the hardships of service to retirement plans. Such relationships, although they had no official status, were an accepted part of barracks life, a reality that everyone saw and accepted. It was its own form of family, created under extreme conditions. It was in the contubernum that the soldier's humanity was preserved. The system sought to turn him into an automaton, but in the close circle of brothers, he became human again. Here you could joke, argue, reminisce, dream. Here you were known not by a number on a list, but by name. Here your life had value not for Rome, but for the 7 men who slept beside you under the same rough-skinned roof. This brotherhood was the foundation on which the whole army was held together. Emperors and generals came and went, but the contubernum remained. It was the eternal, unchanging unit of the legion. And for the common soldier, it was loyalty to the small collective that was the main meaning of his service. He fought not so much for Rome as for his brothers. There was a tense silence in the camp before the battle. Soldiers checked equipment, sharpened swords, wrote short notes, or just sat staring at one point. The fear was palpable. Even the most hardened veterans were experiencing it. It wasn't a matter of not being afraid, but of controlling one's fear. Then the trumpet was sounded. The legion lined up in its famous battle order, usually in 3 lines. Gastats, principals, triarii, although this system was simplified in the imperial era. And so the convergence began. Thousands of feet beat the ground. Ahead was the enemy army, roaring and rattling its weapons. The barbarians often rushed to the attack in a wild, unorganized fury. The Romans, on the other hand, marched in silence, keeping their lines. This silence and equanimity had a psychological effect on the enemy. The first thing to be used was the pila spear. From a distance of 20-30 meters, legionaries of the first line threw their heavy pilums into the enemy formation. The special design of the shaft led to the fact that the spear pierced into the enemy's shield bent, making the shield useless and interfering with its owner. This created gaps in the enemy's defense, and then all hell broke loose. After throwing spears, the legionaries drew their short swords, gladius, and faced the enemy closely. The battle was not fought in the open, but in a tight squeeze, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. Your task was not to fence, but to act like a machine. With a large shield, scutum, you had to deliver short, quick stabbing blows to the stomach, groin, or face of an opponent who was in front of you. There was no space to swing, just a jab. Jab, step forward. Jab, step forward. It was a meat grinder. All around you are the screams of the wounded, the clang of steel, the crunch of bones breaking. Blood and sweat flood your eyes. You do not see the whole picture of the battle, only the back of your comrade in front and the furious face of the enemy in front of you. You act on automatic, on reflexes, beaten into you by years of training. Your first priority is to hold the line. If the formation breaks, you will be crushed and killed one by one. You rely on your neighbor on your left, who covers your unprotected side, and your neighbor on your right. The battle rarely lasted long. Usually they were short, fierce skirmishes, after which one side would retreat. The tired first line was replaced by a fresh second line. This conveyor belt of death was the key to Rome's success. For the common soldier, the battle was the ultimate test. He saw his comrades, his brothers from the contubernia dying before his eyes. He himself received wounds, cuts, fractures, bruises. The psychological shock was enormous. After the battle, many soldiers were in a stupor, vomiting, unable to speak. But it was here that the power of brotherhood was manifested. Survivors helped the wounded, dragging them from the battlefield. Doctors, medici, provided first aid. They washed wounds, stitched them up, and amputated shattered limbs. In the evening around the campfire, the survivors remembered the fallen. This shared grief and shared relief at being alive united them even more. They had survived together, and that was a major victory. Combat was the climax of a soldier's life. It was terrible, but it also gave meaning to all hardships. Having won, the soldier felt not only relief, but also pride. He had stood his ground. He had done his duty. He and his brothers were stronger. And for the sake of this feeling, he was ready to go into this hell again and again. The life of a legionary did not consist only of marching and fighting. There were also periods of calm, otium, when the legion stood garrisoned in a permanent camp on the frontier. But even this rest was far from idleness. It was strictly regulated and full of its own temptations and dangers. Even in peacetime, the routine continued. Drills, repair of fortifications, guard duty. But there was also free time, and each soldier used it in his own way. One of the main entertainments was gambling, especially dice. In the barracks, away from the eyes of the centurions, soldiers could gamble away their modest wages by going into debt to more fortunate comrades. These games often led to quarrels and fights, but it was impossible to prohibit them. Another constant companion of recreation was wine. Although on duty the main drink was pasca, in their spare time the soldiers did not mind having a glass or two of real wine in taverns, which appeared in abundance in the civilian settlements adjacent to the camp. Vici. These villages were the centers of soldiers' life outside the service. It was home to merchants, artisans, veterans, and of course, women. Soldiers' official and unofficial wives, focarii, laundresses, tavern keepers, and prostitutes. The army was a source of money, and life was always bustling around it. Soldiers spent their denarii on food, drink, and love. Relations with local women were complicated. Officially, soldiers were forbidden to marry during their service until the end of the 2nd century AD, so as not to be burdened with a family. But in practice, many had permanent relationships and even children. These unofficial families lived in Vici, and the soldier supported them as best he could. For many legionnaires, especially those who did not have a steady girlfriend, prostitutes were the only outlet. Love for money was an integral part of garrison life, a way to relieve physical and emotional stress. Inside the camp itself, in the cramped confines of the tent, leisure activities were more modest. Soldiers mended equipment, told stories about home or former battles, carved figures out of wood, and wrote letters if they were literate. These quiet moments of being together were important for maintaining a mental balance. Here, in the circle of his brothers, one could temporarily forget about the harsh reality and feel like an ordinary person. Sometimes collective entertainment was also organized. On the days of religious holidays, sacrifices were held, after which the soldiers were given meat. Sports competitions were organized: wrestling, running, javelin throwing. These events maintained morale and gave an outlet for accumulated energy. However, vacation was also a time of vices: vidya, drinking, fighting, gambling, venereal diseases. All these were the downside of soldier life. The commanders looked the other way as long as it did not interfere with service. They understood that people living under constant stress needed a release. This garrison life was a strange hybrid of strict discipline and relative freedom. Inside the camp, you were a soldier, a cog in the machine. Outside, in the Vicus Tavern, you could, for a few hours, become a man again, with your own weaknesses and desires. And this balance between service and leisure, between duty and vice, was part and parcel of the long and monotonous life on the frontier of the empire. 25 years, a quarter of a century. For a Roman soldier, that length of time was both a curse and a sacred goal. To make it through everything, the grind, the campaigns, the battles, the wounds, the illnesses, and to survive to receive an honesta missio, an honorable discharge, was the main dream that kept him going in the darkest of times. The resignation was not just the end of service, but a rebirth, a return to the civilian world, but in a completely new status. The retirement ceremony was solemn. A veteran who had served his term was brought before the commander. He was given a special document, diploma. It was a bronze plaque certifying his status. It listed his merits, the legion in which he served, and, most importantly, granted privileges. If the veteran was not a citizen of Rome, and from the 1st century AD the legions were increasingly staffed by residents of the provinces, the diploma granted him and his descendants Roman citizenship, the highest honor. His unofficial marriage, contracted during his service, was recognized as legal. But the main reward was land, or a large cash payment, premia. A veteran received a plot of land in one of the colonies, often in the same province where he had served. This allowed him to become a landowner, start a farm, and provide for his old age. The state had an interest in veterans settling in the frontier territories. They were a loyal, experienced, and hardened population, ready to take up arms again in case of danger. However, returning to civilian life was often difficult. After 25 years in the army, where your whole life was subject to orders and routine, it was difficult to adapt to freedom. The veteran didn't know how to do anything but fight. He had to learn from scratch how to run a household, trade, and build relationships with his civilian neighbors, who often looked at former soldiers with apprehension. Many could not adapt, drank themselves to death, squandered their fortune, and lived out their lives in poverty. The hardest part was parting with brothers in arms. The men you shared a tent with for a quarter of a century went their separate ways. This loss was harder for many than any physical hardship. Some veterans from the same contubernium tried to settle near each other in order to preserve their brotherhood in peacetime. They helped each other to build houses, cultivate the land, and reminisce together about the old days. Their friendship, forged in the Legion, lasted until their deaths. For them, the war never ended. Sometimes veterans, especially those who did not have families, stayed to live in Vichy near their former camp. They opened taverns, workshops, lived on their pensions, and remained part of the military world they understood. They were living legends to the young recruits, walking chronicles of the Legion. Retirement was the final chord in the soldier's fate. It was a reward for inhuman suffering and loyalty. It gave a chance for a peaceful old age, but it took away what had become the meaning of life: brotherhood, a clear order of things, a sense of belonging to a great power. The veteran, sitting on the doorstep of his new home and looking out over the fields he had cultivated, often remembered not the horrors of battle, but the faces of his comrades around the fire, the monotonous rhythm of the march, and the feeling of elbow in the ranks. He had given Rome his youth and strength, and in return he received freedom, which he did not always know what to do with. The life of a Roman soldier was a paradox. It was brutal, inhuman, devoid of freedom, yet full of meaning, order, and a sense of belonging to something great. The journey from the green recruit trembling on the plaza during the oath of office to the gray-haired veteran with a diploma in his hands was a journey of complete personal transformation. The soldier gave up his I to become part of the we, first the tent, then the centuria, and finally the entire legion. If you are interested in this immersive reality of a Roman soldier, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, write what side of life in ancient Rome you would like to explore further. The world of gladiators, the life of a slave in a villa, or maybe the secrets of the priestesses. After all, history is hidden not only in great events, but also in the everyday lives of those who created it.